Good morning. We are on Chesam and Beis, all the way to the bottom, 8b3. Baimine Rami Barchama Me'er Chista. You see that? 8b3. We have the following question. Okay, so the last paragraph on 8b3, Chesam and Beis, towards the bottom. Baimine Rami Barchama Me'er Chista. Rami Barchama asked the following question of Rav Chista. Na'atz shtei estados. So okay, so you have a mavoi, you have this alleyway, and then outside the alleyway, so the alleyway, you have your walls on the outside. If you're looking from the outside, you have these two walls over here, right? The alleyway is over here, going towards me, and then you go and you stick two pegs into the walls of the alleyway. Okay, you stick two pegs, and then you put a korah on top of those pegs. Normally, we've been putting the korah on top of the mavoi, on top of the walls of the mavoi. Now, what we're doing over here is we have the two pegs stuck into the wall, and then you put the korah on top of that. The picture displays it perfectly. You see that picture, the one picture on 8p3? That's exactly what it is. So you have the peg sticking out, and you put the korah. The korah is actually outside of the mavoi. Okay, so what's the halacha? So v'niach korah al gabehen, right? So you place these two pegs, and you place the korah on top of it. Mahu, what's the halacha? Is the korah valid? Amar le Rav Chista answers, l'divrei hamatir aser, l'divrei oser mutter. Okay, what does that mean? So before we explain translate the words, let's recall that yesterday we had a machlokes about whether or not you're allowed to carry under a korah, right? One opinion says you are allowed to carry under the korah. What does that mean? The opinion that says you're allowed to carry under the korah means, what that's saying is that the korah really is the function of the korah is really at the edge of the korah. If I'm allowed to carry under it, then the function of the korah, meaning the korah really has its halachic status only at the ends of that korah, whereas the one who says I can't carry under the korah was saying that the korah really begins in the beginning, and therefore I can't carry after that, right? The korah really, the function of the korah really is the main part of the korah is really the beginning. So now we're saying, so the one who allows you to carry under the korah, the one who allows you to carry under a korah typically, that means that the korah its function only really starts at the ends of the korah, which means that when you have your wall over here and you have your pegs, the korah really, there's a gap now. Because granted the korah is over here, but the function of the korah really is only at the ends of the korah, and therefore there is a gap. The korah is not really on top of the mavoi at all. It's not connected to the mavoi. There's a space, even though there's a korah standing there, but the real function of the korah is only at the ends of the korah. And therefore the one who says I'm allowed to normally carry under korah over here would say it can't work. Because the korah now, there's almost like a gap between the mavoi and the korah, because the korah really only really functions at the end of the korah. Whereas the one who said, I can't carry under the korah, what does that mean? That means that it's the inner lip of the korah that really starts, and therefore it's flush against the wall, and therefore he says you'd be allowed to carry on. It would be a valid korah. Make sense?
Isn't there a rule of a couple tefachim or 4 tefachim?
So the Gemara points out that lavud's not the Mefarshim. Yes, excellent. The Rishonim asked the question, what about lavud? Lavud means up to 3 tefachim. We're going to see lavud applies to different cases. Over here, without getting into it, short answer is good question. The Rishonim deal with it. They asked this question, why isn't lavud apply over here? But it's not going to apply due to a whole bunch of technical reasons. Okay, but yeah, excellent. Amar lei, fine. Rava disagrees. He says, "L'divrei oser nami oser." He says, even those who normally say that a korah, that you're not allowed to carry under korah, which means that the korah begins to function at the front edge of the korah, but the edge facing the mavoi. Nonetheless, it's aser. Why? Be'inan korah gabe mavoi veleka. You need to have the korah has to be on top of the mavoi, and it is not the case. Okay, so Rava asserts that even if it's flush against the wall, that's not a good korah, right? So basically, you have machlokas here between Rav Chista and Rava about what they're fundamentally arguing about is, let's say you have a mavoi and you have a korah flush against the wall. Right, flush against the wall. And nonetheless, Rava's going to say that is not a good korah because the korah has to be on top of the mavoi, on top of the walls. Whereas Rav Chista is going to say no, as long as it's flush against it, it's going to be fine. Okay, another one is going to deal with Rava's opinion. Esvei Rav Ada bar Masna Rava. Rav Ada bar Masna asked Rava a question. Haisa karaso. We have a brisa which says if you have a korah mishucha utluya, drawn away or suspended. Okay, so the Gemara is going to have to define these terms, but it says like this. If you have a korah, again, the korah is the top bar, and if it is, it's drawn away from the mavoi walls, or it's suspended between them, pachos mishlosha, if it's less than 3 tefachim away from the mavoi walls, ein tzarich lahavi korah cheres. You don't have to bring another korah for the reason that Ross just brought up. There's something called lavud. Lavud is we see something within 3 tefachim as if it's already connected to the walls. However, shlosha, if the korah was 3 or more tefachim away from the mavoi walls, tzarich lahavi korah cheres, you have to bring another korah. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel omer, pachos me'arba in tzarich lahavi korah cheres. If the korah is less than 4 tefachim away, then it's valid. You don't have to bring another korah. Arba tzarich lahavi korah cheres. But if it's 4 away, then you have to bring another korah. Okay, so the Gemara says, my lav. Now, we haven't defined the terms yet, so we're going to see what the question on Rava is. My lav mishucha mi bachutz. Utzluya mi bifnim. So again, the Brisa was talking about a korah, which is not touching the walls, and it says either meshucha, which means drawn away, or tluya means suspended. So the Gemara now is going to assume, the Gemara now is assuming that meshucha means drawn away, that it's away from the, it's like within 3 tfachim, meaning the walls of the mavoi end over here, and meshucha means it is drawn away from the mavoi, meaning it's not on top of the walls, it's actually a little bit extended out. That's what the word meshucha mean. Tluya would mean suspended in the inside. You see that like almost like a cross-looking thing in the first diagram, right? So, sorry, the T. Yeah, that's a better. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jesse. So what's it called? So Jen, sorry. What's it called? If it's
vertical doesn't go over the horizontal.
I'm sorry.
Because the vertical.
Yes, exactly. So if it's a T, thank you, then that's the one that's not the question. That's tluya. It's suspended, meaning it doesn't hit either of the walls. But meshucha means drawn away. Meshucha would seem to mean that it's drawn away, meaning it's extending past the entranceway of the mavoi, and nonetheless we're saying within 3 tzvachim it's kosher. Rava said even when it's flush against it, it's not kosher, right? This would seem to be a question on Rava, right? Rav Chisda said if it's flush against it, it's going to be kosher. Rava said, no, if it's flush against it, it's not going to be kosher. It has to be on top. This brisa seems to say explicitly, meshucha drawn away is not kosher. The Gemara says, no, that's not a question. Both are inside the mavoi and therefore are like parallel with the walls. What do the words mean? Meshucha meruach achas utluya mishtei ruchos. Meshucha means drawn away, meaning it's not going over the entire mavoi. Rather, it's drawn away from one side. Tluya means that it's like the picture we saw, the T, that it's not connected on both sides. In other words, we've been assuming meshucha means it's drawn away, it's outside the mavoi, and it's drawn away, meaning it extends beyond the wall, beyond the entranceway. And now we're saying no, meshucha just means there's a gap on one side. It's drawn away from one wall. That's all it means. Okay, and the Gemara says, "Ma'adatema." I would have thought miruach achas amrina lavud. We only apply lavud in one direction. Mishtei ruchos lo amrinan. We don't say it in 2 directions. Kamash malan. No, the novelty of this brisa is to say that not only when it's meshucha, i.e. drawn away from one wall, is it going to be kosher because of lavud, but even when it's drawn away from both walls, but it's within 3 tzvachim or 4 tzvachim on each side, it's still going to be kosher. Good, and therefore there's no question on Rava. We're still sitting with fine. The Gemara has another answer to this question. Rav Ashi Amar Meshucha v'hi tluya. The way to read the brisa doesn't mean it's 2 cases, but rather what it means it's drawn away and suspended. 2 things are happening. It's not 2 cases, one meshucha, one tluya, one drawn away, one suspended, but rather it's one thing. What is that referring to? There are 2 bent pegs, like upside down L-shaped pegs. You see the picture over there? L-shaped pegs. Now again, how wide does a korah have to be? What is that? No, that's a lechi. The lechi can be very thin. The korah has to be 1 tefach. So a yaste, the peg, we're talking about a peg that's obviously less than 1 tefach, and that's why it can't function as a korah. Okay? So basically it's an L-shaped thing. It goes like this, and then you have a korah on top of it, right? So this we ignore halachically because it's nothing. Okay? But then you have the korah on top of it. So what's the on the 2 walls. The height is within 3 tvachim. And the bend is not 3 tvachim. In other words, the korah is both within 3 tvachim vertically and horizontally. Right? So basically it's within the L-shaped peg is shorter than 3 tvachim in both directions. Right? The L is shorter than 3 tvach in both directions. And mahu detema, I would have thought, o lavud amrinan, o chavot amrinan, lavud v'chavot lo amrinan, kamash malan. So lavud means, what does lavud mean? Lavud means that within 3 tvachim, horizontally, you're able to ignore that gap. Chavot means when you have a roof, let's say you have a roof that is for different halachic reasons, you have a roof that's elevated from the walls. Chavot means we treat it as if it's connected, as if it's down. So the Gemara's saying, I would have thought that I can't do 2 of these. These are both like halachic realities. In other words, these are like virtual realities. In other words, the korah is not really touching the wall. It's too short, it's too high, but the bottom line is you have chavot, which brings it down, you have lavud, which extends it. The Gemara says, maybe I would have thought I only do lavud, or I do chavot. I can't do 2 virtual walls at the same time. Kamash malan, the Bryce is teaching me I'm allowed to do them both at the same time. That's what the Gemara is telling me. And bottom line is, again, let's just remind ourselves where we are. What Rav Chisda was telling us, that a korah is able to be beyond the walls, beyond the walls, and Rav is saying no, it has to be on top of the walls. We thought this brisa was a question. The Gemara says no, there's no question, and therefore again, Rav is still holding that the korah has to be on top of the walls. Even sometimes you're going to use lavot or chavot, but the bottom line is, and Rav Chisda says it can even be beyond the walls as long as it's flush to those walls. Okay? Makes sense? Let's go further. Tani Rav Zakai, we're on 982. Tani Rav Zakai, Mikamed Rav Yochanan, Bein Lechayayim, the area opposite the lechi, V'tachas HaKorah, and under the Korah, Nidon ki Carmelis, is judged like a Carmelis. What's a Carmelis? A Carmelis, again, is the space, it's not Rosh Hashanah, it's not Rosh Hashanah, it's biblical, it's rabbinic, like we'll treat it rabbinically like Rosh Hashanah, okay? So he's saying, the space opposite the Lechi, where the Lechi is thing on the side, and the space under the Korah, both of them are like a Carmelis in the sense that you can't carry it under them rabbinically, okay? And when Rav Zakai taught this in front of Rav Yochanan, Amalei Rav Yochanan said to Rav Zakai, Puk Tani Lavra, go teach us outside, which is a way of saying it's a stupid whatever. Sorry, it's not a halacha, it's not a brisa, it's a corrupted brisa. Okay, and now the Gemara is going to analyze which is it all of it corrupted, is part of it corrupt? We'll see. So Gemara's Amar Abaye, Mistabra Milser Rav Yochanan Tachas HaKorah. Rav Yochanan presumably when he said teach it outside, he's referring to the halacha that he said under the Korah is like a Carmelis. Why? Because if you recall, we had two opinions. One opinion says you're allowed to that under Carmelis you cannot carry, which would be consistent with this brisa, and one says you are allowed to carry. So that makes sense. Rav Yochanan presumably holds you're permitted to carry under a Korah, and therefore he was saying, teach us outside because you are allowed to carry under Korah, don't treat it like a Carmelis. However, but regarding opposite the Lechi, that makes sense. Rav Yochanan presumably would agree that it's usher to carry opposite the Lechi, which we saw earlier an opinion that said everyone agrees opposite the Lechi, where the Lechi is, again, the Lechi is a side post, everyone would agree you're allowed to carry. Okay, so again, Abaye wants to say that Rav Yochanan was only rejecting the first halacha, the halacha of the Korah, treating a Korah like a Carmelis, but treating opposite a Lechi like Carmelis. He says, Rav Yochanan would probably agree to that. There's no reason to assume not. However, Rava disagrees. Rava Amar, Bein Lechayayim Nami Mutter. Rava says, no, even opposite the Lechi would also be permitted. Okay? Now, what's the reason? What's the support for Rava's halacha? Amar Rava. Rava says, Mina Minala. Where do I derive this position that you're allowed to carry opposite the Lechi? Dechi Asi Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he reported the following in the name of Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Dimi was one of his students. He travels to Bavel, and he says the following. Makom she'em ba arba al arba. An area less than 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, okay? That is between Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah, okay? So you have a space that is less than 4 by 4. You have Rosh Hashanah outside, Rosh Hashanah inside, and you have a space in between which is less than 4 by 4. Okay, it's like a standalone space. So mut livnei Rosh Hashanah, livnei Rosh Hashanah lechatef alav. The people in Rosh Hashanah are allowed. Let's say a person in Rosh Hashanah is holding on to something, right? So they'd be allowed to go and place it onto this less than 4 by 4 place. Okay, it's its own domain, and a person in Rosh Hashanah is able to place things onto that space. Okay, we saw this in Masech Shabbos and like Daf. Hey, okay, but they can't switch. In other words, if I'm in Rosh Hashanah, I can't take the thing out of my pocket, put it on this space which is less than 4 by 4, and you in Rosh Hashanah take it and bring it into private domain. That we're not going to allow, more rabbinically, but you are allowed to go ahead and place things onto this, from coming from Rosh Hashanah and from coming from Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so what do you see? Fine. So what that means is that. So what that means is that Rava holds that opposite the Lechi, okay, is basically a space. It's its own space. It's its own space of less than 4 tefachim, okay, and therefore it's its own space less than 4 tefachim. Meaning we treat it as its own space, and therefore you'd be allowed to carry in that space. Again, once there is a Lechi, once there is something sticking out, it kind of separates it from both spaces. It's not Rosh Hashanah, it's not Rosh Hashanah, it's its own space. And so you see, though, that Rav Yochanan held him allowed to place things into a space that's less than 4 by 4, right? Meaning it's its own space, even though it's it's next to Rosh Hashanah, it's next to Rosh Hashanah. We treat it as its own space. I'm allowed to place things on it. So why wouldn't I be allowed to carry between those lechis? See the similarity? Fine. The Gemara Abaye rejects that. Abaye says, no, what are you talking about? Hasam megavoa shlosha. There we're talking about it's like a stoop. The case in that Rav Dimi says in the name of Rav Yochanan is where it's also elevated, where it's really separate. We're talking about we're talking about a case where you have a mavoi. Okay, you have an alleyway. At the edge of an alleyway, there's a stick that stands out, which kind of creates its own little space. So don't tell, that's not similar, and therefore Rav is saying, look, you're allowed to carry there. Why? It's no different than the case Rav Yochanan was talking about, where I'm allowed to take things from the private domain and put it there, public domain and put it there. Rabbi says, what are you talking about? That's a case where there's also an elevation.
Yeah.
where it's also picked up. And by being picked up, it's really seen as a separate place. But here, all you have is something on the side making it shorter, more narrow, but you have nothing elevating it to really make it a separate space, and therefore there's no proof from that case. Fine. Okay, Amar Abai. Abai says, what's my proof? What's my proof to you? Damarav Chama Bar Guri Amarav Tocha Pesach, the area within the entranceway. Tzarech Lechi Acher Latir needs another lechi. Don't turn the page yet. You see, okay, before we turn the page, a typical mavoi that we've been talking about until now is two flush walls. It looks like this. Okay, this is your mavoi, two walls, right? However, if the walls themselves bend, then that is your lechi. In other words, which makes sense, right? The whole point is to show that it's a separate, the point is to show like, oh, there's some stoppage over here, right? So if the walls themselves bend, you're good. You don't need another lechi. That is a lechi. However, Rav comes along and says that the area within the entranceway, okay, tzarech lechi acher latir needs another lechi. Look at that picture. That's why it's not on the page. That you need, if you have walls that turn, in order to allow carrying within that space within the entranceway, you need to have an additional lechi. Okay, so what does that show? That shows that if you want to carry within that space of the side post, you're not allowed to carry within that space. Right? In other words, what is he saying? He's saying it's a good lechi. The walls, when they bend, are a good lechi. In other words, it allows you to carry in the mavoi in the alleyway. But if you want to carry in that space of the alleyway, if you want to carry in that space of the doorway where the doorways bend, you need another lechi in order to carry within that space. So what does it tell you? It seems to be explicit that Rav is saying that you're not allowed to carry opposite the lechis. Right? Again, let's review one more time. Rav and Abai are arguing, are you allowed to carry opposite a lechi, opposite the side post? Right? Rava says you are allowed to carry opposite the side post, and Abai says you are not allowed to carry opposite the side post. Rava tried to bring a proof, rejected it. Fine. Now Abai is in the middle of bringing his proof, and Abai says, I'll show you where the proof is, because Rav talks about a case where I have a mavoi which has walls sticking out, i.e. a legitimate lechi. Everyone's going to agree I'm allowed to carry now in the private domain, but if I want to carry opposite those walls, right, opposite these walls up over here, my fingers, you'd have to put another lechi over there, like the picture on 9a2. Right? Make sense? So, v'chitema, okay, and if you want to reject this, to say the ispe arbal arba, if you want to say that the reason Rav needs to have an additional lechi over there is because it's a very large, the width of those walls that are sticking out are not thin, they're actually 4 by 4. They're at 4, okay? And therefore it's a full-fledged space onto its own, and only there will you need to have an additional lechi. But in a regular case of a regular short, more narrow lechi, you would not need to have an additional lechi, meaning the only reason you need a second lechi over there is because it's such a wide space, it becomes a space onto its own. That's not true. Rav says explicitly, Chanan bar Rava says explicitly in the name of Rav, that this is so even when it's more narrow than 4 by 4. Okay, so you see, again, what's the proof? The proof is, or the attempted proof is, that when you have a mavoi walls that are sticking out, right? They're not so wide, they're 2 tzvachim. If you want to be able to carry between them, you need to have an additional lechi, which is exactly what Abai is trying to prove, that you're not allowed to carry between the walls, between them past the parallel to the lechi. Right? Everyone with me? Right? This seems to be the proof? Okay. So Rava says, no. Hasam de pasuach lekarmelis. Where Rav says it's not, where Rav says you need it, Rava says like this. What Rav Yochanan, who we were talking about before, is saying that you're allowed to carry between the lechi, parallel to lechi, is when you have Rishus Yachid, you have the Carmelis, you have the Mavoi, which is the private domain, and Rishus Ram is right over here, right? There, you're allowed to carry opposite the lechi. Where Rav said you need to have a lechi for your lechi, in other words, you're not allowed to carry between the lechis, is specifically when it's adjoining to, it's adjacent, there we go, it's adjacent to a carmelis. There, you need to have an extra lechi. Now, Tzvi is giving me this face saying, what are you talking about, right? Meaning, carmelis is more lenient, right? This doesn't make sense. When it's adjacent to a Rishus Rabim, it should be more strict. Right, so what's going on over here? And the Gemara actually asked this question. The Gemara says, you want to tell me that Rav Yochanan would say that you're allowed to carry opposite a lechi when it's adjacent to Rishus Rabim? Okay, there's a very, what's the word? There's a politically incorrect phrase over here. But basically what it's saying is, the phrase is, a citizen is on the ground, and the alien is on the alien is on the high heavens. What that means is basically, when you have someone who is a resident of the city, presumably they're going to have like a higher position than someone who is like an immigrant, right? The immigrant will not have the higher position. So basically, it's like this is like backwards. It's a way of saying it's backwards. Okay, the resident is on the ground, the other person in the heavens, meaning they have like a higher position of authority. Okay, bottom line is this that makes no sense. But when it's next to Rosh Hashanah, then when it's next to Rosh Hashanah, you should need more stringencies. When it's next to Karmelis, you need less stringencies. The Gemara says no. In matzah min esmino v'neir, okay, which literally means one kind has found its own kind and been awakened. This halacha plays a role in regards to we have mixes of meat and milk and whatever it has. It's usually found in another place. But what the bottom line is, what we're saying is like this: when you have a Carmelis next to a when you have a Carmelis next to a Mavoi, in some ways because it's less of a distinction between the Mavoi, which already is really a Carmelis, and before you put the Eruv, it's a Carmelis, right? Carmelis is again that quasi, not really private domain, and it's next to another Carmelis. It's much more easy to just go smoothly between them. But if I see a Rosh Hashanah in front of me, like, whoa, I'm already going to be on my own, care, like I'm going to already be careful, and therefore not go past it, right? So basically what's coming out, and therefore we see, yes, in some ways we're going to be more strict by a Carmelis, because in a person who knows anything, or a person just even looking around, it's much more logical to say that they're one and the same, because they are one and the same. The Mavoi is really a Carmelis before you fix it, and you have a Carmelis in front of you. But if it's a Rosh Hashanah over here, I have a full-fledged highway over here, whoa, I'm not going to easily go in. This is a highway, there's like cars racing everywhere, and this is a Carmelis, and this is my Mavoi. I'm not going to easily go in between. I don't need as much. So again, what are we saying over here? Bottom line is that Rav is telling us that Rav Yochanan would be telling us that opposite a lechi, you would be allowed to carry. When it's adjacent to a public domain, or Rosh Hashanah. When it's adjacent to a Carmelis, which is much more similar to the Mavoi, if I want to carry between the lechi, I need an additional lechi to allow me to carry there. Good? Not so crazy. Okay. Says